空英才艺媒体营开始报名喽！7月共2批次，3天打造媒体精兵。5月5号前享早鸟价，详情请洽空英商城。现在请收听教学节目。
Advanced Studio Classroom is on the air. Interruptions today on Advanced Studio Classroom. Hello, friends, and welcome back to another Advanced Studio Classroom. My name is Simon, and you are joining me in the studio today for our May communication article. We're talking today about a lesson called Dealing with Interruptions, and we're offering you a few smart ways to avoid suffering in silence. Joining me in the studio to talk about this topic today, we have Garrett. Welcome back, Garrett.
Hello, Simon. It's good to be back. It's been a little bit since I've been on Advanced Studio Classroom Radio, but it's good to be here.
It's good to have you. Garrett, you are famous for interrupting people here in the office, are you not?
I hope you are making a joke right now. I don't think so.
Yeah, I don't think people really do interrupt each other too often here in the office. It's kind of a rude thing to do, isn't it?
That's true.
Yeah, there's actually a lot of focus on interrupting people in the English language and in sort of English culture, Western culture at this time. Wouldn't you say, Gabe?
Oh, yes. Hey, everybody. I'm here too. And it's great to be here. I didn't want to interrupt you, Simon. I had some things to say there, but, I didn't want to interrupt.
I saw you eager to speak, so I thought I'd throw the ball to you.
No, it's true. I guess there's a big emphasis on not interrupting people.
Well, I think really the focus is on giving people a chance to speak about their experiences and their stories. That's sort of really what Western culture seems to be focusing more on, this idea that some people have more opportunity to speak than other people. And so the culture seems to be moving towards offering everyone a chance to speak. The idea being that sometimes it's hard to let people just speak and speak without interrupting them, right?
I suppose you're right. I find the opposite problem to be true. Sometimes someone does want to speak and you have something to say, but then you're never sure when to go in. And then they change the subject, and all of a sudden you realize it's a completely different subject and you haven't even gotten your 2 cents in.
It's dangerous territory, the interruption. It could be rude, but it could also be necessary.
Sometimes people just keep speaking, and we need to bring the conversation back to the important things, maybe. But there's a balance there.
But today, I think we're not talking so much about the idea of, letting people speak in general. We're talking more about things like small groups working together in things like meetings or, trying to share an idea with a friend in a conversation, somebody who keeps cutting you off, kind of jumping ahead and not giving you a chance to finish your thought or what you're trying to say, right? And so the idea here is that today we're talking about interruptions on a much smaller scale, and hopefully we're going to be able to offer you a few points that you might use to avoid this situation. There's 3 points in particular. Today, I think we're going to go through this in 2 readings. One of them is going to be a little bit longer. The other one will be shorter. And so I think we should jump into our first reading now. Listeners, you'll find that on page 10 of your May magazine. We're going to read down through the left-hand column now.
Dealing with interruptions. Here are a few smart ways to avoid suffering in silence. Having a conversation with a colleague or customer who constantly interrupts you is one of life's most frustrating experiences. But there are effective tactics you can use to get your own point across. Here's some of what the experts advise. 1. Discourage interruptions before they happen. If you're about to tell an involved story or make a complex proposal, you may be able to protect yourself from interruptions by making that clear up front. Workplace consultant Laura Rose told CBS News. Explain that once you're done, you will want the other person's input. By letting the other person know in advance that their opinion will be heard and valued, you're encouraging that person to hear you out and to listen carefully to what you're about to say so as to provide a worthwhile response. 2. Ask the rest of the group for input. If the same person has interrupted you repeatedly, one tactic is to say something like, "We've heard from Sam a few times. Does anyone else have anything to contribute?" You're nicely putting the interrupter on notice that he or she has been hogging the conversation, and it's time to let others speak. You're also encouraging the less assertive members of your group to speak up, which is always a useful thing to do.
Okay, and so in this first reading, we're introduced to the idea of being interrupted in a conversation with a colleague or customer. Now, we're using here mostly the term interrupt or interruption, but we've already used another term that people sometimes use in the same way, cut off. Garrett, do you know of any other terms we use?
Yes, we have a kind of an interesting one. I don't know what the origin is, but we could say if we interrupt someone, if we cut them off and jump into the conversation, we might be butting in to that conversation.
And that's B-U-T-T-I-N-G,
Yes,
right?
That is correct.
Not B-U-T, B-U-T-T-I-N-G, to butt in, B-U-T-T. Yeah. So that's what you're doing.
It's a great mental picture you have.
Yeah,
Someone putting their butt into the conversation.
Yeah, I don't know. I have no idea what the origin of that phrase would be, but it is very common.
Your butt, it's describing your body as a whole, and it's like your physical presence is moving into this conversation.
Mm-hmm. The only thing I can think, and listeners, I am just guessing here, there is no authority behind this at all, but the only thing I can think is that, you know, when you are getting onto a crowded subway, you turn around and you push in backwards, right? Like you put your kind of butt out first.
Sure.
To wiggle your way into the crowded space. People do the same thing when they're trying to cut through crowds. Like if you're holding a tray full of something and you're trying to cut through a crowd, you kind of turn around and go backwards, right? So maybe it means kind of push in.
Yeah, using part of your body to kind of, get in somewhere.
Yeah.
I also hear this term used when people are driving on the road. I mean, they might not actually use their butt. They're driving a car, right? Mm-hmm. But they're trying to get into traffic somehow, and they might butt in.
Or like cutting in line.
Cutting in line,
right?
Yeah.
Well, we also say cut into a conversation.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So all of these things are different ways of describing interruptions. Here they basically start off by describing a frustrating situation. They say, having a conversation with a colleague or customer who constantly interrupts you is one of life's most frustrating experiences. Just quickly, Gabe, remind us what a colleague is.
Yeah, well, usually a colleague is someone who you work with. Colleague could have the definition of someone who's on the same level as you, maybe working at a different school. So if you're...
Different company.
Yeah, different company.
The same kind of job, maybe.
Same kind of job, yeah. So if you're talking about people who work in your company alongside of you, I would use the word coworker to be more specific, but maybe this is intentionally not specific.
Colleague tends to have a very white-collar feel to it, though, like a professional kind of feel, like you would say. You wouldn't say my colleague when I was cutting grass, but you would say like my colleague, the doctor over at that other hospital, right? So it's kind of got a professional feel to it. It goes on to tell us, though, in this first section that there are effective tactics you can use to get your own point across. So when they say get your point across, the idea here is not that you're having a quick moving conversation where people keep, I don't know, like you're telling a long story and people keep, I don't know, walking past you, and it kind of interrupts your story. We're not talking about that here. We're talking about not being able to say the thing you're trying to say because the person keeps interrupting you.
Sure.
So a very specific sort of situation. We now have some advice, and these are tips from experts. What is tip 1, Gabe?
Yeah, well, discourage interruptions before they happen.
Yes.
So if you think that they're going to happen in a certain situation, maybe because they've happened before, maybe you're used to dealing with this certain group of people, and there's always one person who doesn't let somebody else finish their thoughts. You got to be aware of that and maybe say something or do something to discourage that before it happens.
Yeah, you just begin every conversation by saying, if you interrupt me, I am out of here. This conversation finishes.
They might be
right
happy
away.
about that.
I've had classes.
Got to give a good threat, though.
I've had classes that I've been teaching that I've wanted to say that to at the beginning of the class. If any of you interrupt me, and then I'm leaving.
They'll be so happy.
Yeah.
No more class.
That's the problem, right?
No.
They'll be like, oh, great, the teacher's gone. Okay, so we get into here another situation. Garrett, tell us about what the situation they're describing here is.
Yeah, so it says if you're about to tell a story or make a proposal, you might be able to protect yourself from interruptions by making it clear up front from the start. This is from workplace consultant from CBS News. So pretty cool job.
That's right. And it's not just any story that our lesson is talking about. If you're about to tell an involved story, and if something is very involved, that means there's a lot of details that you want to share. It's not something that can be communicated in just one or two sentences.
Complicated. Lots of characters you have to remember, lots of little details that have to be clearly communicated. Okay, now, They said here that you want to make it clear from the start, right? They actually said make that clear from the start. What exactly is that? Are you trying to make clear that people are not allowed to interrupt you, or are you trying to make clear that this is going to be an involved story that requires close listening?
You want to make it clear what kind of thing you're about to talk about, and just to signal to those to the usual interrupters not to say anything because you have something very involved that you would like to share.
Because my advice at the beginning of this tip was not expert advice. When I said begin every conversation by saying don't interrupt me or I'm going to that would be rude, right?
Yeah, it would be hard for most people, I think. It's really hard for people to stay focused for a long time. If you're about to tell this long story, a lot of people don't just want to sit there and listen. They have thoughts on your story. They want to share their opinions too. But if you really need to get through your whole story, your whole proposal first, maybe letting them know first could be helpful.
That's right.
Saying don't interrupt me is pretty aggressive.
Well, you're right. Well, in the first paragraph, we saw the word tactics, right? There are effective tactics, and it makes me think of the related word tactful. So I think that's the idea, is that you're trying to be tactful. That is kind of having good manners, as opposed to another ruder way of saying something. Yeah.
So you're not saying don't interrupt me, you're saying listen carefully. And then they go on to say that you're saying listen carefully because when I'm finished telling the story, I want your input. Input here just means like opinion or thoughts or advice or whatever it is you happen to think about the story or any questions brought up by that story.
Or some feedback or maybe, follow-up questions like you said. Yeah.
The idea being that they say here, by letting the other person know in advance that their opinion will be heard and valued, you're encouraging them to hear you out. Hear you out there means listen to you without interrupting you. Right?
And that's a great phrase to know. I mean, to know how to use, like, hey, can you hear me out for a second? And then I want to hear what you have to say.
And then basically the idea is you're suggesting that to the person that they need to listen carefully or they won't be able to provide a valuable, here they say, worthwhile response.
That's right.
Yeah. So understanding the full situation will make their input or their opinion more useful to you. And, that's
and more informed, too, right? They've heard you say everything you have to say instead of just half of it because they interrupted. And so now they have something more meaningful to share.
Okay. Now, I tend to see this situation as being sort of more in a conversation or when you're asking for advice or help from one person. In the second tip, I see it more as being kind of like in a meeting where one person is interrupting or sort of dominating the situation, maybe changing the topic. So it says here in the second tip, which is ask the rest of the group for input, It tells us that if the same person has interrupted you repeatedly, there's a tactic you can use. What is that tactic, Garrett?
That's right. The tactic is kind of to invite other people into the conversation. So they give a little scenario here of someone speaking to a group, and there's a guy or a girl named Sam who presumably keeps interrupting. We say, we've heard from Sam a few times. Does anyone else have anything to contribute?
I love that line. We've heard from this person a few times. That's a really nice way of saying, shut up, you talk all the time. You talk too much.
Yeah, so there's sort of two messages in this quote we see here, this statement, this example statement. The first is this idea of we've heard from Sam a few times, meaning thank you for your input, Sam. And then we ask other people to give their input and maybe interrupt Sam.
Yeah, because
right?
some people, they have a lot of thoughts, which is a great thing, but they tend to kind of dominate conversations. They have so much to say that other people don't feel welcomed into sharing their input. And that can be really hard. It means that less people are heard from. And so I think with all of these tips, the biggest thing is people want to feel respected. They want to be able to share what they have to say, and often a business environment can be very competitive. Everyone wants to, as we say, get their 2 cents in.
That's right.
They want to share what they have to say.
We have a few descriptive terms that are sort of describing the Sam situation in the next sentence. First is this term hogging, the idea being that Sam, who we have heard from a few times, has been hogging the conversation. When you hog something, a hog, first of all, is a word for a pig. And so the idea here is, a pig is usually thought of as being greedy, taking everything for themselves. And so that's really
for some reason I think of a hog in a mud hole, right? And maybe he's trying to, take up the whole space and just do what he wants to do and not let other hogs do it.
If you fed pigs, like they don't care about sharing with the other pigs, they just kind of take all the food themselves. So
that's probably where the phrase came from.
And so when you warn Sam about this, even though it's very gently, the phrase they use is you're putting Sam on notice.
And, another time I've used this word hog is when I'm playing something like basketball. Have you ever heard of a ball hog?
Ooh, yes. A ball hog is a person who hogs the ball.
It's like they never pass it to their teammates. They're always trying to do everything by themselves and make every point by themselves.
That's right. Won't pass the ball. Ball hog. Terrible. I guess the other thing you're doing there, Garrett, you mentioned that people want to sort of feel respected. They want to be, invited to participate. If you're at the meeting, there should be a reason that you're at the meeting, right?
Yeah.
Don't invite people to the meeting who have nothing to contribute. So if you're at the meeting, you can assume that it's because there's a reason for you to be there, and you should have a right to participate in the meeting. And so,
but I think that Garrett, sorry to interrupt, I think what Garrett was saying earlier was that some people maybe don't feel welcome, even though they're invited to the meeting. It's like, there's this other really dominant person, and I'm not sure when I can share what I need to share. And so, not like they don't have any input themselves, but they're not sure when they can do that. And so, though, another word that comes to my mind is facilitator. I think the person who's in charge of the meeting has that job of officially saying, okay, you've spoken enough, and now we want to hear from somebody else. We haven't heard from you. Maybe you can share with us your thoughts.
And I actually have a lot of experience with this, having had the opportunity to lead smaller groups in a church setting. You often have one person who just has a lot to say, and that can be really overwhelming to the other people. I think especially in a business sense, there's a balance there, where people who are maybe a little more afraid to speak up maybe need to learn to be a little bit more, as we use the word here in our article, assertive, to put themselves out there and speak a little bit more. But at the same time, some people can definitely be too assertive.
Okay, so what we're doing here is we're encouraging less assertive, so people who are not very assertive, to participate more by speaking up. So you want to give them a chance to do that. And that brings us to our second reading, which you'll find in the right-hand column on page 10. Let's go through that now.
Three, ask yourself if the interruption has value. Some people interrupt because their brains work very fast. They've already grasped the information you're conveying, and they want to speed up the pace of the discussion, explains writer Tema Ehrenfeld in a post at Psychology Today. If you stop and listen to the interrupter and ask a couple of clarifying questions before firmly leading the conversation back to your original point, you will come across as more interested in the issues than in yourself, she explains. Try it out. While none of these tactics is guaranteed to protect you from interrupters, trying one, or maybe more than one in combination, should help you be heard instead of talked over. Getting interrupted is always unpleasant, but you don't have to suffer in silence. Make sure you get to have your say.
Okay, so the third tip here is basically presenting an idea that maybe the interruption is happening for a reason. They say here, ask yourself if the interruption has value. So maybe you're being interrupted for a good reason. Something that needs to be said is being said, and that's why you're being cut off. So it says here, some people interrupt because their brains work very fast. What do they mean by that, Gabe?
Were you hoping for a faster response, Simon?
No.
My brain's not working fast enough. Well, okay, so the idea is that someone whose brain works very fast, they hear the first, maybe even just the first couple of words that somebody says, and they kind of think they know the direction that that person is going, and they're already making conclusions in their mind, or maybe even figuring out a problem that the person hasn't even fully mentioned yet. And so that's what I think it means if someone's brain is working very fast.
I think a lot of conversation is not, I mean, I don't want to say it's not useful, but it's not about the main idea of the conversation. So you think, for example, if you're at an office and you run into your coworker, the first bunch of sentences you're going to say, I mean, this is the classic example of writing or reading a Let's Talk in English conversation, right? The first thing they say is like, oh, hi. Oh, hey, how are you? Oh, I'm fine, thank you. And you? Because the two characters are meeting for the first time or again after a while in every single conversation, right?
Sure.
And so you have this polite kind of language that's kind of used. But then on top of that, there's also things where, like, even if you're talking about a topic that you both understand, you have to kind of review to make sure you both understand it the same way and agree on certain things, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of the things that people say in a story is actually kind of review and background information and stuff like that. And so if you have a person who's already familiar with those things, they might just want to jump ahead and get to the main idea, right?
Sure.
So you can sort of see this sort of thing happening. So the way they sort of say this here is they use in the second sentence, they say they've already grasped the information you're conveying. So when you convey something, it's like you're transporting it or delivering it. The idea is like you're moving information from you to another person. And they're saying here the other person has already grasped that information. Grasp, we use this word to describe doing something with our hands, right, Garrett? What are you doing when you grasp something?
Grab onto it almost. So in this context, we are grabbing onto the information. We understand it.
So the person's like transporting information from themselves to you, and you reach out and you take the information because you understand it. So when you've grasped this information, the person wants to speed up the pace of the discussion to move past this and get to the really interesting part of the conversation.
I understand that, I got to say. I mean, I think we've all had
that was a quick response that time, Gabe.
Well, no, I think we've all had this kind of conversation, right? Where you know where the person's going. That's the phrase we would use. And when you understand something that someone wants to say, we say you know where someone's going. And so you want to speed up the pace of the discussion so you can get to the main point. Maybe especially if the main point you know is going to be kind of uncomfortable. So you just want to deal with it and get it over with.
Yeah, so I guess the danger here is that when you're trying to tell a story, you're focused on telling your story. And you've sort of laid it out in your head the way you want to tell it. And when you're interrupted, you're inclined to ignore the interruption and just, want to continue delivering your story. But there might not really be a need to do that. And so what they say here is if you stop and listen to the interrupter and ask a couple of clarifying questions, so you're asking them to make sure they sort of understand what you're trying to say, then you can firmly lead the conversation back to your original point, right? So you can get to what you were trying to say over the long term. The idea there being that this makes you look good. How does this make you look good, Gabe?
Well, that's true. Although I think it's kind of interesting, if the person already thinks they know your original point, maybe that's part of the problem too. Their brains are working so fast, it's like they've already spoken your original point. You have nothing to go back to in the conversation. Maybe that's the case.
Yeah. Okay. So there might be some value in the interruption, and if you're humble enough to sort of look at that honestly, you might be able to get into some really interesting conversation more quickly. Our last little section there is called Try It Out, and the idea here is that none of these things are guaranteed to stop interruptions. But if you use one or two of them or a bunch of them all together, you can probably have a better chance of being heard, getting across the thing you want to say. Then they finish with this sentence, make sure you get to have your say. When you have your say, what are you doing, Garrett?
You are getting your chance to say what you want to say, to get your point across.
Listeners, thank you so much for joining us on today's Advanced Studio Classroom. We hope you'll be able to join us again for another program soon. Until then, I'm Simon.
I'm Garrett.
And you two are interrupting each other. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.